Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that features deep dives into some of the most interesting countries in the world through my experiences in working there and also through their history, their geopolitical context, and their culture. The countries that we deal with on this podcast are all included in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which encapsulates my more than 40 years in the economic development business, but especially the 25 to 26 years I spent in international development, traveling around the world, rebuilding economies of United States allies. So I hope you'll check this out. It's on Amazon.com if you haven't got your copy already. And we are on episode 31 of the Some Stops Along the Way podcast. Episode 30 began a look at the Philippines, which is a fascinating country and one that I really enjoyed during my time there. And we're going to continue that discussion today. Here's the interesting thing about the Philippines. I shared some of my initial comments with you during the last episode. But today I want to really deep dive into the leadership of this country. The Philippines first declared its independence, if you will, in 1899, but it was not acknowledged by the United States, who was the quote-unquote colonial power at that time in the Philippines. The United States didn't acknowledge the independence of the Philippines until July the 4th, 1946. But since 1899, the leadership of the Philippines has been part and parcel of the trajectory of the country. And I would argue that this is true in virtually any country in the world. Countries where you have strong leadership that's sustained over time are those that tend to be much more successful from a governance standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from a social standpoint. Those that have poor leadership, it goes without saying that all of those systems that I just mentioned are likely not sufficient for success. But even more challenging sometimes is this roller coaster ride that countries tend to take, where they have a strong leader and then they have a weak one that undoes all of the gains made under the strong one, and then another strong leader comes and has to rebuild what was lost during the time of weak leadership. And so you have countries going through this cycle like a roller coaster of peaks and valleys that lead it to great instability. And instability has significant ramifications, negative ramifications, in building economies and political structures. And the Philippines has been somewhat like this. As I said, Philippines first declared independence in 1899, and so they had a series of presidents, some who were stronger, some who were weaker, all the way through World War II, and then even afterwards. I'm not going to discuss all of those leaders today. I'm going to begin the discussion today with some of the more modern Philippine leaders, which will give you an example of this roller coaster ride that I'm talking about. And I'm going to start with one of the most iconic leaders of the Philippines, in my lifetime anyway, Ferdinand Marcos, who was president of the Philippines from 1965 until 1986. Now, he was the 10th president of the Philippines. And yet, when you think of the Philippines, and if you were asked to name a former president of the Philippines, Marcos' name would probably be at the top of everyone's list. Whether or not they would know exactly what he stood for or what he did, his name is certainly one that at least in my youth was very high profile. And there were reasons for that, and the reasons weren't always good. So let's start with this discussion of Marcos and go from there. Because to understand the Philippines and where it is today, you really have to understand how it got there from a leadership standpoint. Because the aggregation of the decisions made by these leaders are what has brought the Philippines to the point that it is now. So let's take a look at Marcos. In talking with my friends in the Philippines, even today, it's clear that whatever people think about Marcos, there's very few people in the middle. You either are very much supporters of Marcos or you are very much a detractor. And that pendulum has swung just a little bit over the past years. When Marcos was deposed, he had a preponderance of Filipinos on the detractor side. But over the years, I think history has reflected a little bit of a softening of attitudes toward Marcos. And so more people now are on the other side of the pendulum. But there are very few people in the middle because he is a very polarizing figure in Philippine history. Marcos was born to a middle-class family. His father was a lawyer and his mother a teacher. Actually, his father was executed for being a Japanese sympathizer during World War II. Now, whether or not this was the case is up for a lot of debate, but certainly he was considered to be a sympathizer of the Japanese and was executed for it. Marcos trained as a lawyer, and by all accounts, he was a very bright student. But while he was training as a lawyer, he got interested in politics. And after World War II, he became one of the founders of the Liberal Party and served in the Philippine House of Representatives for 3 terms. In 1959, he won a Senate seat and went on to become Senate Minority Floor Leader in 1960. He also was a Liberal Party president from 1960 to 64. In 1965, Marcos took the steps toward becoming the icon that history will reflect, as he ran a populist campaign for president in 1965. But during this campaign in 1965, certain traits of Marcos' personality began to come to light that were greatly, I would say, exacerbated later on. For instance, during the campaign for president in 1965, Marcos greatly exaggerated his war record. As a matter of fact, during that campaign, he made the statement that he had won numerous war medals that would have been impossible for him to win. As a matter of fact, history later reflects that most of them were awarded to him in or around 1962, retroactively, if you will, purportedly so he could use them as campaign fodder. While this was discussed during the campaign, it came to light during the campaign, it wasn't a limiting factor, as he won the election and was inaugurated the 10th president of the Philippines on December 30th, 1965. while I say it wasn't a limiting factor, it did give a little bit of a window into Marcos' mentality. By virtually anyone's estimation, whether you like him or whether you don't, history reflects that Marcos was a very shrewd politician, and he was very much out for himself and his family and those supporters around him. And he understood how to build a power base and solidify a power base. And I think that this is what led, first and foremost, to Marcos building of the power that he needed to be successful in his first term. But ultimately, this strategy also became his undoing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. You see, many times politicians become one-trick ponies. They have a certain way they view the world and a certain agenda that they want to espouse, and they lock into that. And all of their actions are based on that philosophy. But as the world changes and people's points of view change and the political winds start to blow in a different direction, sometimes the strategy that put one in power and built that power base is the same one that ultimately erodes it. And that's what happened to Ferdinand Marcos. Soon after he was elected president, Marcos launched an aggressive infrastructure development campaign, which was appreciated by the Philippine citizens. After World War II, the Philippine infrastructure, its highways, its airports, its electrical grid, had been severely damaged in World War II. And even by 1965, when Marcos became president, the infrastructure of the Philippines was very much behind that of the rest of the world. And so Marcos began immediately to address this issue. Now, one would say on one hand, that's a great strategy that builds the economic capacity of the country, and that's true. However, on the other hand, we know from the political playbook that if you want to feather your own nest, so to speak, if you want to build your power base, if you want to generate bribes and other type of illicit income sources, then infrastructure projects are a great way to do it because they require bids. And unless there's a system in place to ensure that the bidding process is fair and transparent, infrastructure projects sometimes are a license to steal. And so in this case, history does reflect that Marcos and his cronies utilized these infrastructure projects. At least the perception was, let me put it that way, that they utilize these infrastructure projects as not just a way to build the economic potential of the country and to modernize the country, but also to create illicit income sources for themselves. Again, that is up for debate. But what's not up for debate is the fact that these infrastructure projects cost a lot of money and it put the country into debt. Also, Marcos had a strong relationship with the military. Again, not a bad thing in most cases, because it's important for the military and the chief executive of the country to have a close relationship. However, the motivation behind this relationship in Marcos' case is depending on which scholars that you read and you discuss. It's widely perceived among those that I talked to in the Philippines that his motivation for being so close to the military was to ensure that those who supported him in the military stayed in place and that they would protect, the military would ultimately protect his interests because he took care of them. There's a lot we don't know about Marcos' engagement with the military, but here's what we do know. We do know that he took the unprecedented act of making himself the Secretary of Defense in addition to being president. Therefore, he not only was the chief executive of the country, but he had absolute power over the military. We also know that he elongated the tenure of many senior leaders in the military who were friendly to him, well past their retirement ages, purportedly to ensure that he had a strong power base. Of course, ultimately, this strategy backfired, but in the beginning of his administration, this focus on infrastructure and his close relationship with the military helped solidify his control and his authority. Marcos was also a very shrewd operator when it came to foreign policy. It was interesting that at the same time that he was somewhat cozying up to the Russians and the Chinese, he also gained support from the U.S. administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson through his involvement and his work with the United States during the Vietnam conflict. So Marcos had a lot of things working at the same time. He wanted to make sure that whatever scenario played out, it was a scenario that was going to be favorable to him. And that takes a shrewd politician to be able to navigate that for as long as he did. As I said, Marcos' early initiative was to expand the Philippine military. This included raising the defense budget and tapping military leaders for civil projects such as school construction, etc. And Marcos' policies led Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., called Nino, to accuse Marcos in 1968 of trying to establish a garrison state. During Marcos' early reign, the military was almost a shadow government. Their hands were in everything, not just on the defense side, but really every aspect of society. And people like Aquino began to call this out. So, Marcos' first term was widely perceived as successful. Even with all of the challenges, even with all of the maneuvering behind the scenes, even with the calls by people such as Senator Aquino that the administration was corrupt, his first term was widely categorized as successful by the Filipino people. And that led him to become the first president of the Third Republic of the Philippines to be reelected. However, this is when things, the wheels, if you will, started to wobble. Because Marcos began to take on massive foreign loans to fund what he called the rice, roads, and school buildings that he promised in his reelection campaign. With tax revenues inadequate to fund his 70% increase in infrastructure spending from 1966 to 70, Marcos covered the gap with loans, creating a budget deficit 72% higher than the Philippine government's annual deficit from 61 to 65. So what he began to do in his second term is to radically expand the country's debt in order to address all those promises that he made while he was running for re-election. This is right out of the playbook for a lot of politicians. I remember very vividly my time in the Republic of Georgia. The same thing happened there. When Mikhail Saakashvili, who became president of Georgia after the Rose Revolution in 2003, his first term was extremely successful. But his second term, again, the wheels started wobbling and eventually came off because of the same type of thing that Marcos did. He increased the debt. There was wide perception of corruption, and ultimately he left office in disgrace, and now actually is in prison in Georgia today. And so this strategy that Marcos used to get elected in 1965 and then to get re-elected had the underlying cracks in the underlying foundation that became apparent early on into his second term. Marcos launched $50 million in infrastructure projects during his 1969 re-election campaign. And Time and Newsweek called that election the dirtiest, most violent, and most corrupt in modern Philippine history. The term 3Gs was widely used: guns, goons, and gold, to describe the administration's election tactics of vote buying, terrorism, and ballot snatching. And these are not my words. These were the words of both the Philippine and international press at the time. So shortly after Marcos' re-election in 1969, many of the Philippines' infrastructure notes came due, causing a payment crisis. Marcos' second term was characterized by social unrest, beginning with the balance of payments crisis, where it became apparent to the people of the Philippines that even though all these infrastructure projects were ongoing, number one, the major benefactor was Marcos and his administrative cronies, but also it was bankrupting the country. Opposition groups began to form, with moderate groups calling for political reform and radical groups espousing a radical left ideology, rather. And this led Marcos to take an extraordinary act. With all of this noise going on around him, all of this unrest around him, Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines on September 23rd, 1972. And this martial law lasted for a number of years, where essentially Marcos' power base of the military controlled the country. He suspended Parliament. He suspended major elements of the Constitution. And he did it all under the umbrella of security, keeping the country safe from radical groups, in his mind, that were trying to tear it down. Again, this is a page out of the despotic leader's playbook. to squelch the opposition. You declare martial law, you suspend the systems that are in place to create checks and balances, and you therefore can control the situation much better as long as you have the army and police on your side, which at this time, and during this period, he did. Marcos was elected for a third term in 1981 and served until he was deposed in 1986 by the People Power Revolution, which was led by Corazon Aquino, the wife of Benigno Aquino Jr. Now let's talk about Benigno Aquino Jr. for a moment. He was an opposition leader, a senator. He very much opposed Marcos' policies. Aquino was a reformer. By all accounts, a very learned and credible individual that had a lot of support among the Philippine people. But he was assassinated in 1983 at the Manila airport. It was rumored at that time that Marcos was either directly or indirectly linked to that assassination. Again, that depends on how you view history and what sources you want to believe. But what we know is that when Aquino was assassinated, this had a reverse effect to what many in the Marcos administration wanted, and that is it galvanized the people. It began to galvanize the people who were already upset, who were already starting to support the opposition. It galvanized them against the administration. And as a matter of fact, Marcos survived an impeachment attempt in 1985. Things got so bad that eventually the strong relationship that Marcos had with the military began to crack. The bills for all of his infrastructure projects had come due. The country was in terrible economic straits. The opposition was growing stronger. The People Power Revolution was out in the streets. And this led, on February 25th, 1986, to Ferdinand and his wife Imelda Marcos fleeing the Philippines with a 90-member entourage. And they went to Hawaii, which was strange, or perceived strange at that time, although Marcos had been an ally of Ronald Reagan. When Marcos showed up in Hawaii with his 90-member entourage, even Reagan himself, kind of put Marcos at arm's length. But no one really knew what to do with him. And so Marcos, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos lived in a life of luxury in Hawaii, while the Philippine economy was devastated due to the actions taken during his 3 administrations. Marcos died on September 28, 1989, in Hawaii. He was buried there. His family wanted to bring his body back to the Philippines, but that was denied for many years. And finally, after several years, his body was brought back to the Philippines for burial. This galvanizing figure of Ferdinand Marcos, who lived so much excess. As a matter of fact, he and Imelda, at the time they fled in 1986, were really the poster couple, if you will, for excess. When the People Power Revolution broke into the presidential palace after the Marcos fled, they found thousands of pairs of shoes that Imelda had left behind. They found all types of luxury that the Marcos had possessed that the rest of the country had no access to. Again, this is right out of the despotic leader's playbook. living in excess while the people live substandard livelihoods. So, Marcos is gone. And the next president of the Philippines was Corazon Aquino, who was president from 1986 to 1992. Cory Aquino, as I said before, was the wife of Senator Benigno Aquino, the opposition leader who was assassinated in 1983. And history reflects that Cory Aquino was one of those leaders who was able to rebuild not just the economy of the Philippines, but also its governance structures and its governance system. In late 1985, when the Marcos administration was in its death knell, he called for a snap election, and Aquino ran for president with former Senator Salvador Laurel as a running mate. After the election was held on February 7th, 1986, Marcos was proclaimed as the winner, which prompted allegations of electoral fraud and created massive civil disobedience. As a matter of fact, a people power revolution immediately took to the streets from February 22nd through 25th and was part and parcel of dislodging, if you will, the Marcos administration, because this revolution led to massive defections in the armed forces of the Philippines and, very importantly, the consternation of the Philippine Catholic Church against the Marcos administration. And those forces combined, the populist movement of the People Power Revolution, defections within the military, and the reversal of the Catholic Church view of the Marcos administration led to his ouster. The interesting thing about Cory Aquino is that not only was she the first female president of the Philippines, but she had never held an elected office. And so here was a lady who literally swept into power after one of the most galvanizing presidents in Philippine history and had never served one day in public office before, which made the construction of her team extremely important. And she built a strong team around her. Cory Aquino's accession to the presidency marked the end of authoritarian rule in the Philippines. She was not only regarded as or acknowledged as the first female president of the Philippines, she was actually the first female president in Asia. And immediately upon taking office, she undertook the drafting of a new constitution, which limited the powers of the presidency and established a bicameral Congress. This is a really important step in the modern history of the Philippines, because Cory Aquino, this novice at politics who is now president, really presided over the putting in place a system of government that is still extremely instrumental to the Philippine success to this day. She restored the checks and balances system. And by limiting the power of the presidency, she ensured that it would be very difficult for another president to be able to do what Marcos had done. Her economic policies focused on forging good economic standing among the international community, as well as de-establishing Marcos-area crony capitalism monopolies, emphasizing the free market and a responsible economy. Cory Aquino quickly became a favorite of the West. A friend of the United States. She was widely extolled in Europe and other areas of the world for her vision and for her willingness to make the tough decisions to build a strong economy and governmental structure in the Philippines. And this didn't only mean building something. As I said before, it meant tearing down some of the structures that Marcos had built during his administration. One of the biggest challenges early on for Gloria Aquino, when all these other things were going on, and she was, on one hand, developing a new constitution, on another hand, trying to solve the debt crisis, on another hand, trying to rebuild the Philippine economy, on another hand, trying to rebuild its governance structure. At the same time, there became public outcry to close the U.S. bases in the Philippines. This was a political flashpoint for Gloria Aquino because she knew that it was going to be not perceived very well by her strong ally, the United States. But this was not a knee-jerk reaction. The presence of these bases in the Philippines after World War II had become really, in the minds of many Filipinos, to be a reminder of the colonial nature of the United States relationship with the Philippines. And as a free and independent country, they believed that these military bases were the United States' way of extolling too much influence over the Philippines. And so they became a symbol of a time that the Filipinos wanted to move past. Ultimately, Gloria Aquino did support and preside over the closure of all the U.S. bases in the Philippines, including the two of the largest, Clark Field and Subic Bay. Subic Bay was then transformed into what's akin to a large industrial park or industrial complex that exists in that form to this day. Even though she was doing all of these things that were beginning to restore order and restore the economy of the country, Gloria Aquino's policies were not without their detractors, especially from those who still held either tacit or overt links to Marcos. And she overcame many coup attempts during her tenure as president. But Gloria Aquino's administration was widely perceived as successful, and this period where order was restored in the Philippines. Regrettably, Gloria died of cancer on August 1st, 2009. And was heralded around the world for her leadership. The non-politician who was thrust into the spotlight and tasked with the daunting challenge of rebuilding the Philippine economy and governance structure, which she did. Aquino was followed by the administration of Ferdinand Ramos, who served as Philippine president from 1992 to 1998. Ramos was a Filipino general and politician, a former ally of Marcos, but during that period of upheaval in the mid-1980s, he broke with Marcos and supported first Benigno and then Corazon Aquino. One of the things that Ramos did when he took over as president was start to build on what Aquino had started. and he authored something called Philippines 2000. The vision of what he believed the Philippines should be moving into the 21st century. Ramos ushered in a period of economic growth and stability. The Philippine Stock Exchange in the mid-1990s was one of the best in the world. And this Philippines 2000 strategy led the country into a newly industrialized economy. And it was even called the Tiger Cub economy in Asia. Anybody know what the Asian tiger was? Well, the Asian tiger was a moniker that was used to highlight, if you will, the emergence of South Korea as an economic power. So the Philippines was called the Tiger Cub because they were using many of the same techniques and approaches that were used to build the strength in South Korea, the economic capacity in South Korea, and applying them to the Philippines. So Ramos brought not only this resurgence of economic capacity, a resurgence of government capacity, or governance capacity rather. He brought a period of stability that was desperately needed after all those years of Marcos from 65 to 86, because he built on what Aquino had started and was able to take it to the next level. Ramos died of COVID at the age of 94 on July 31st, 2022, and again, was widely viewed, while he had his detractors, widely viewed for the success of his policies. But things change. The political winds start to blow in a different direction. Sometimes countries become a victim of their own rhetoric. And that's likely what happened in the Philippines during this time. Things are going well. There's a period of stability. And yet there are those who don't benefit from good governance and stability. There are those who seek to undermine those kind of structures because it's economically advantageous for them, or it's advantageous from a standpoint of building a power base. And this is what really occurred in the late 1990s in the Philippines. And this led to the ascension of Joseph Estrada as president from 1998 to 2001. Estrada was very much a populist. He was swept in on a populist wave. He was a film actor and a model. And he was elected in 1998 with a wide margin of votes and sworn in on June the 30th of that year. He came in during a period, as I said before, of relative economic stability with reasonable governance structures in place. But there were still many challenges in the country. One of those challenges was coming from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which was based largely in Mindanao. Right after World War II, a lot of the challenge had been with fighting against the communist movement and trying to suppress the communist movement in the Philippines that was occurring at that time in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other places. With that under control, then it became about radical Islam. And that's where Estrada really focused his efforts to defeat the Moro Economic Liberation Front. At the same time, he began to chip away at many of the governance structures that Aquino and Ramos had put in place, and there were widespread allegations of corruption during his tenure, which spawned an impeachment trial in the Senate. And in 2001, he was forced out of the presidency during the second EDSA revolution. Estrada is widely perceived as someone who, if not overtly corrupt, certainly surrounded himself with those people who gave him extremely poor advice. And as a matter of fact, he was arrested on April 25th, 2001 and charged with plunder. His supporters then rallied and marched to the presidential palace and attempted to storm the premises, as a matter of fact. He was impeached and jailed for embezzlement, but later he was pardoned. But he was ousted from office on January 20th, 2001. So here you have this polarizing figure of Marcos. And then this period of rebuilding and stability of Aquino and Ramos that then led to a giant step backward with Joseph Estrada. And then came Gloria Arroyo, who was the daughter of the former Philippines president. And again, her administration was widely perceived, while she had her supporters, definitely. The highlights, if you will, during her presidency surrounded a lot of corruption allegations. She was president for almost 10 years, 2001 to 2010, during which time the governance structures of the Philippines remained largely in place, but the economy began to lag, especially during the 2008 global economic crisis. The economy of the Philippines, as with most of the world, began to contract. And this was exacerbated in the Philippines by the fact that now you'd had, coming off of Estrada, you'd had a chipping away of these reforms and these structures that Aquino and Ramos had built. And so you were, instead of moving forward, you were moving backward into more of a chaotic and more of a crony type system. When Arroyo left office, the next president was Benigno Aquino III, son of Corazon Aquino and Benigno Aquino II, the opposition leader who was assassinated. He was president from 2010 to 2016 and actually died in 2021 of kidney disease. Again, he undid many of the policies of the Arroyo administration, began to rebuild economic capacity, and try to move the country forward. And so there was this period again of rebuilding what had been lost over a couple of administrations of Estrada and Arroyo. And then came Rodrigo Duarte, who was president from 2016 to 22. Duarte was an interesting dude, is all I can say. I was in the Philippines during the time that Benigno Aquino III was president. But what came after him was an interesting individual who was arguably one of the most polarizing figures since Ferdinand Marcos. During his administration, Duarte was involved in numerous scandals, including the creation of death squads, sexual abuse. You name the scandal, Duarte name was linked to it. It was a period, a low period for the Philippines from the standpoint of both governance and global visibility, which led again to the winds of the political spectrum beginning to blow in a different direction. And in 2022, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president. His nickname's BongBong. It's interesting how we've gone full circle. We started with Ferdinand Marcos being elected in 1965. And we end with his son, BongBong, being elected in 2022. Certainly there have been continued scandals under BongBong's administration. Again, depends on which sources you believe and which version of events that you want to believe, but the scandals have continued to swirl. However, his economic reforms have been reasonable, and today the Philippines has an economy that continues to grow. It is a very populous country, but one that is known for its beauty. It's a great place to go for tourism. It's got a lot of economic capacity. But one wonders where it could be today if it hadn't been for this huge roller coaster ride that it took since 1965. With all of the nonsense under Marcos, and then this rebuilding period under Aquino and Ramos, and then the step backward under Ramos. I'm sorry, the step backward under Estrada, rather. And then the somewhat of a resurgence under Arroyo, and somewhat of a resurgence under Aquino, and then this huge step backward under Duarte. It has literally been a ride of ups and downs where the Filipino population is locked in their seats just waiting to see what happens. So what does this tell us? What does this deep dive into the leadership of the Philippines really tell us? It is a cautionary tale. First of all, it highlights, as I said in the beginning of this podcast, the importance of leadership, especially transparent leadership that has a vision for the country. But where it becomes a cautionary tale is that all of those gains can be erased very, very quickly. Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic and the first president after the communist government fell in the Czech Republic, said it this way: it takes dozens of years to paint a beautiful painting or to create a beautiful piece of furniture. But it takes just that long to destroy it. Governments and economies, governance structures, they're not built overnight. They're built over time with a succession of leaders making good decisions that are in the best interest of the country. But it takes almost no time to tear down those structures. Building is almost always more difficult than tearing down. Think about it. How long does it take to build a building, a skyscraper. How long does it take to implode one? It's a great metaphor for a country. And this is what happened in the Philippines. You gain this traction, and then you'd lose the traction. So I think that those of us in countries like the United States, Western Europe, this is a cautionary tale for us as well. That should make us think when we go to that ballot box and cast our vote. Are we voting for the person who most aligns with our political ideology? Or are we voting for the person who has the strongest vision for the country as a whole, whether or not it totally aligns with our political thoughts? Today we're talking about the Philippines. We could be talking about the same situation in any number of countries around the world, including, quite frankly, our own. Another thing this tells you is that structure, checks and balances are critical from a governance standpoint. If one person has all the power, like Marcos did during martial law, they can do whatever they want. So it's very important to have the limiting of that power, these checks and balances that Cory Aquino put in place after Marcos, where no one branch of government has the power, the sole power, or no one ruler has the sole power to do whatever they want. That's where a transparent and effective court system comes into place. That's where a transparent and effective bicameral legislative body comes into place. If you don't have that, then it's a license for a leader that has their own agenda to do what they want. And a third thing to think about here, that's a cautionary tale, is be careful what you ask for. You might get it. After this period of Aquino and Ramos, where the economy grew, there was stability, there were groups within the country that felt like that they needed to move a different direction. And so this populist movement swept in, and this high-profile enigmatic figure of Joseph Estrada came to the forefront. And it was a widely perceived, and history will reflect, a mistake. So be careful what you ask for. The same strengths that brought Estrada into office were ones that became weaknesses that created these pockets of corruption. All of the controversy that swirled that eventually led to his impeachment. So, something to think about. Hope you've enjoyed this discussion of the Philippines over these couple of episodes. We're going to move on with highlighting some other countries in South and Southeast Asia over the coming episodes. So stay with us. Every Monday morning, 8 a.m., a new episode of Some Stops Along the Way drops, and we will see you next time. Have a great week.